Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for another video response to the Today Divorcee Stan Seder. Recently, I saw a video by Jeff Ahern over on Rumble. I'll have all the links in the video description, talking about how Burlington, Vermont seriously reduced the number of police officers, and oh my gosh, their homicide rate has spiked. So, I've got data from Burlington, Vermont. I got their homicides from whoa, that was probably loud, sorry. From 2011 to 2022. And then I got the homicide rate from 2016 to 2022, so you can see how it trends. A lot of years they had 0 or 1. But over the last 3 years, from 2020 through 2022, and it was right after the drug addict who terrorized a pregnant woman with a firearm, George Floyd, had his little run-in with the Minneapolis police, and they said, oh, we better get rid of a whole bunch of our police too, and we'll be safer. So from 2020 to 2022, the Burlington homicide rate is much higher than the 2016 through 2022 period. That was 3.927 per 100,000, which is high, very high for Vermont standards. So Burlington's been one of the problem children in Vermont for a while. It's like any other place. There are pockets of violence, and most places are safe. Burlington has a homicide rate much lower than the national rate, but it is one of Vermont's problem areas. Over the past 3 years, as I mentioned, since they began shrinking their police department, their homicide rate has run a bit hotter than the 7-year average. According to the FBI, from 2012 to 2021, there were 9 homicide incidents and 10 offenses reported by Burlington Police Department. There were 5 in 2022. Of the 15 offenders for those heinous crimes from 2012 to 2021, 40% or 6 of them were black, and 40% of the victims were black in a county and city that is uber white. Uber white Vermont with a very low homicide rate, and they've had constitutional carry since they became a state. According to the FBI, 2012 to 2021, of the 108 homicide offenders in Vermont, where the race of the offender is known, 12.96% or 14 of those offenders were black, and of the 122 homicide victims, 8.19% or 10 of the victims were black. Vermont is a low homicide jurisdiction overall, but like most states that have a low homicide rate, there are pockets of violence. Iowa has the same issue, but in a handful of cities named Des Moines, Fort Dodge, Waterloo, Cedar Rapids, and Marshalltown. Then I've got Vermont homicides. They're not the rate, but I've also got that as well. But they're homicides from 2011 to 2021. Apparently, now I read a few news articles that said they had 25 this year, but they're including justifiable homicides. I don't want that, so I didn't include 2022 till I get the FBI data. And Vermont state reports are useless because they just send you over to the FBI now. So from 2016 to 2021, Vermont had a homicide rate of 1.989 per 100,000. That's even lower than Iowa. We need one more year of data, in my opinion, for 2023 to determine if Burlington's spike in murder/non-negligent manslaughter is an outlier or a new normal. However, it is quite odd. And if Democrats are going to autistically repeat that correlation does not equal causation, then say the exact same thing the next time someone complains about the U.S.'s rising homicide rate over the past few years and the number of guns in this country. It is quite odd that not long after Burlington severely cut the number of police officers there, they saw a spike in murder. Now for a questionable article by a clown named Katya Schwank over at the Baffler, and the reasoning over there is baffling. Here's one of the money lines. Quote, studying crime data is like staring into an ink blot, an amorphous cloud that can be distorted to fit any narrative. End quote. That's very important. Keep that in mind. Will Katya call out Chuck Schumer or the mentally deficient AOC the next time they say we have a crime epidemic? We have seen our homicide rate go up substantially 2020 to 2022, but there are still a boatload of counties, and I'm not going to cover this all because I'd be here for eternity. About 45% of all counties as recently as 2020 and 2021 had 0 homicides, and almost 23 million folks live there. I estimate that in 2016, 2017, because I did several states and got a good sample size, in 2016 and 2017, roughly 2/3 of counties had less than 2 homicides. Again, will Katya Schwank call out those carnival barkers like the overweight Black Hawk County, Iowa supervisor Chris Schwartz who say, quote, we are not safe anywhere, end quote? I doubt she will. If crime data can be spindled, folded, and mutilated to mean whatever you want it to mean, then there are a lot of Democrats who have had their entire narrative on gun control demolished. I do know that the most violent counties in America tend to skew towards the Democrat Party, and black men tend to kill black men at an alarming rate, much higher than any other demographic, period. That rate is even more pronounced in cities that have a lot of poor black folks that have been run by the Democrat Party for decades. East St. Louis, Flint, Detroit, Baltimore, Chicago, Cleveland, Memphis, Camden, Wilmington, etc., etc. She brings out that line to try and undermine anyone who says, see, defunding the police has exacerbated our homicide problems. That's only part of it. It has to an extent. Black Lives Matter and their mob has contributed to it as well. That leads us into the next quote from Schwank's article. Quote, but murders are up across Vermont, but I thought crime data could be fit any narrative. Oh, but murders are, quote, murders are up across Vermont and indeed across the country, end quote. But not in every county. There are few counties with less than 2 homicides today than 6 years ago, and far fewer counties with no homicides today than in the 1980s, when the homicide rate was much, much higher than it is now. Homicides were much more concentrated in the 80s and 90s than they have been in the last 6 or 7 years. What would she have said in the period 1985 to 1992 or the 1910s and 20s? I will have a video on that at some point. You look at the homicide rate in the 1910s and 1920s through the mid-30s. Holy crap. Pardon my almost French. What would she have said in the period 1985 1992 when it was much, much worse? Just blather, they be up everywhere. No. They are not. Burlington is one of the problem cities in Vermont, as I've said, and I would wager it has been for a while, and I've gone back to 2011, so yes, it has been for a while. Vermont is uber white too, and just a bit of the picture. Cook County and St. Clair County are the consistent problem areas in Illinois and have been for some time, even though homicide spiked in the land of Lincoln too. Are we suddenly worried about homicide now? Even though the usual suspects like St. Louis and Chicago and Detroit and Baltimore have been crime hellholes for half a century. I found these 2 statements interesting from Schwank's article. Here's the first one. Quote, Sarah George, the top prosecutor in Chittenden County, which includes Burlington, is frustrated by the way the issues have been presented in the press, as she emphasized to me recently. George is staunchly reformist, often called one of the most progressive prosecutors in the country, with the typical priorities of her peers, expanding diversion programs and ending cash bail and so forth. Here's what she said. We have, for example, this uptick in people stealing cars. She told me this is another highlight of the crime coverage in Burlington. She said, what I see as a lot as a prosecutor getting those cases is that the people are stealing them to live in them. And what am I going to do about that? What does accountability look like when someone is stealing a car to live in it? End quote. And here's a second statement. Quote, any power that the trend lines hold is trumped by visceral anecdotes that serve as evidence of some nebulous problem. A split lock, a shattered window, a stabbing in the night, each one the bellwether of something worse. The Times is reporting on crime now. They're complaining about the New York Times. That's often something progressive Democrats do. They try to label anything. They'll try to label everything right-wing. And they'll even attack the New York Times. The Times is reporting on crime in Burlington leads with bicycle thefts, but the article ends with something more sinister. A young man shot execution style in a park, his distraught girlfriend beside him. Implicit here is the argument that these faceless bike thieves, the subject of the article, will soon, too, become killers, should they be allowed to continue unchecked. That poverty that becomes visible, should it be to remain seen, will turn into violence, end quote. If a person steals a car to live in it, they are prosecuted for the same crime as an upper middle class man stealing a car to strip it and make money. That's what accountability looks like. What is the root cause of homelessness, to quote your fat vice president? Drugs / and or lack of a father, most of the time, which will also can lead to not finishing school. It's not always the cause of course, but some children turn out just fine despite the fact they only had one parent active in their life. But what if every child was raised by one parent who was a drug addict versus every child being raised by 2 parents who were there every night to tell them, I love you, Junior, now finish your homework, please, and brush your teeth? Dave, if you're listening to this, that brush your teeth thing's for you, buddy. As far as bike thieves, not every bike thief is a murderer, but almost every murderer did not start killing people as their first offense against society. They likely engaged in some larceny, some vandalism, maybe stole a car or two, aggravated assault, and then worked its way up to criminal homicide. It's the broken windows policing policy where the police don't let the small things slide, like vagrancy in front of Fred's hardware store, men blocking the street to clean your windshield, people pissing all over the sidewalk and spray painting the backsides of buildings in the alley. If you start to let those things slide, it is a slippery slope paved with soap. Nobody is saying that Junior should be put away for 15 years for spray painting F the police on the side of Larry's used and abused cars. But if you let that go, it will snowball. That proactive policing is one of the main reasons Rudy Giuliani was able to clean up New York City. No more squeegee men, no more tolerating spray paint artists, no more peeing on the sidewalk, which they're trying to let go now. No more sleeping in front of the restaurant. All that, eventually New York City became a very safe place. Does Katya really think there should be no punishment for stealing a bike? Of course not. But she begs the question. There is a cost to that. Some kid doesn't have his bike to do the paper route, even though I'm not sure paper boys even exist anymore. Stealing a car has a cost, even if all you do is steal the car and you hurt no one else. What if Tammy needs it to drop off her and Tommy's youngest child at daycare before going off to her job selling real estate? Now, she cannot drop Junior off, and she misses the showing of the house to a prospective buyer. The article quotes someone saying that it's hard to tell if crime has increased in Burlington since the summer of 2002, or I meant to write 2020 there, I'll correct that. Summer of 2020 when the police had their ranks cut. Well, looking at the homicide numbers 2020 to 2022 and comparing them to the previous 4 years, the answer is yes. Here's another questionable quote. Quote, the conundrum was this: despite fear-mongering by elites about the imagined impacts of reductions to the immense resources of cops in a country with some of the best resourced police agencies in the world, no cities had meaningfully defunded their police. This made fear-mongering more difficult. Enter Burlington, end quote. This means to say that if you haven't completely demolished your police department and replaced them with, quote, whatever, then you have not, quote, meaningfully defunded, end quote, it, and thus your argument is BS. I call BS on that, as a number of departments like Seattle and Portland have seriously reduced the number of LEOs, and they are reaping the rewards of that. It's akin to saying that because Bill Clinton and Congress did not hike personal income tax rates to the perch they attained under the Carter administration, that means the Republicans won and the Clinton-era tax hikes were of null effect. I should also mention again that this article argues that crime is up everywhere, and in almost the same breath says crime statistics are like an ink blot that can be tortured into whatever result you want. Doesn't make sense, but then again, I don't think many of the authors at the Baffler make much sense. Their stupidity and bad logic is indeed baffling. And one more quote from the piece. Quote, when a loose coalition of activists and organizers led by an organization called the Vermont Racial Justice Alliance launched a campaign for reform in Burlington, they listed a 30% reduction in uniformed officers as a key demand. Because if you have less, as an aside, if you have less officers and there's a riot, there's less people to control that riot. Yet the request was shorthand for a more powerful vision, an immediate restructuring of the entire public safety apparatus. Reparations, change. The cuts were voted through. Most of the rest was quickly trapped in a bureaucratic snarl of committees, reports, and consultants. The cops left, but nothing took their place. An assessment that was intended to suggest alternatives was delayed for more than a year, and then proved decidedly uncreative in scope. So here she is actually giving it to these idiots. Critiquing racial disparities in the agency's policing, but recommending that the department partially reverse its cuts and hire more cops. Advice the city has been trying to heed. The creation of a limited crisis intervention team staffed by social workers has been promised but has not yet come to fruition. Good luck, social workers dealing with meth heads wielding garbage can lids and swords. Progressive city councilors have won elections defending the police cuts. The discontent is imported, broadcasted, notching some victories, yes, but it has not yet won, and for now, the cops have not yet returned. And you're reaping what you sow. Their absence has become a sounding board, a tool for those interested in preserving the status quo. But it was not meant to be. City leadership promised something new in their absence, and she's giving it to them again. Not a lukewarm critique by high-paid consultants, not a social worker or two, but a sincere challenge to the institution of policing. For that, we are still waiting, end quote. Makes me hearken back to something Thomas E. Wood said a few years ago, and I'm going to paraphrase. If you're going to replace the police, I want to hear what you're going to replace it with before I sign on. It sounds like Burlington in typical progressive fashion, and referring to Democrats in Burlington as right-wing because they're only opposed by regressives would be akin to referring to Hitler as right-wing because he wasn't a communist. It sounds like Burlington in typical progressive fashion just burned the building down, metaphorically speaking, without having any blueprints, without hiring anyone, or having any plan to construct a new building. You will reap what you sow, Burlington, and what you sow, so shall you reap. In closing, the crime wave in America is largely a Democrat crime wave, and it has several facets. One, defund the police / reduce the number of LEOs, or intimidate the police into no proactive policing in high crime areas. This makes it much harder to apprehend carjackers, purse snatchers, meth dealers, and vagrants who assault old ladies because the police won't be anywhere near the crime scene. They know where the crime is occurring. They need to be there. This also ensures that the next time the fatherless Black Lives Matter terrorists go on a rampage to intimidate the public into giving them what they want, or else the police will not be there to stop them. Two, when Kyle Rittenhouse, or another good guy with a gun, goes out and stops the next riot that happens, the Democrats will want to jail him for murder. There's my phone. I'm going to leave that in there. This ensures that the next time the fatherless Black Lives Matter terrorists go on a rampage to intimidate the public into giving them what they want, or else nobody, including the police, will be there to stop them. Three, Soros-backed prosecutors like Sarah George will continue to let violent criminals out of jail so they can go back into society and terrorize the public. You'll see some data I got below. I'm not going to read it. In Dallas, a lot of the people being let go, they weren't even, they were let on bail, not for murder, but for something less than murder, and then they committed murder. Do you think that Chaz/Chop crap that went on for 3 weeks would have lasted more than a few hours in Iowa? If these lunatics tried to cordon off an area in rural Iowa after driving their rusted-out Priuses there, do you think the locals would tolerate that? No, they would not. And the county sheriff would be there very soon to disband it because he knows the locals will do it for him if he doesn't. That's why that crap was able to continue in Seattle for so long, because they have a Black Lives Matter culture, and the stench of racism always fills their nostrils, even if it is their upper lip providing the odor. It will be interesting to see how it goes in Burlington over the next few years. I personally hope they do this again so they can be another petri dish demonstrating what happens when you eschew law and order for chaos. The real insurrection is a Democrat insurrection. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Radical Antifa-associated leftists are calling for a night of rage and full of violence after one of their alleged armed protesters shot a cop, then gets killed when the cop shot back. This all took place where the Atlanta Police Department training facility is set to be built. The scenes from the Atlanta Forest Twitter account tweeted this flyer. Listen to this, folks. Consider this a call for reciprocal violence to be done to the police and their allies on Friday, January 20th. Wherever you are, you're invited to participate in a night of rage in order to honor the memory of our fallen comrade. Antifa thugs seen marching to the park after blocking traffic, chanting "Stop Cop City." Some of the group continues to throw bird scooters in the middle of the road, impacting traffic. Officials say they won't stand by while criminal acts are happening.
The GBI and all law enforcement agencies and our partners here embrace a citizen's right to protest, but law enforcement can't stand by while serious criminal acts are being committed that jeopardize the safety of the citizens we're sworn to protect.
All right. So joining me now, editor-at-large for the Post Millennial and author of Unmasked, Andy Ngo. Andy, what do you know about this incident?
Well, this is the stochastic terrorism that we often hear the left raging on about. It's coming from their side. explicitly through a number of accounts with very large followings and being retweeted by even larger accounts, calling for, as you showed a moment ago, a night of rage that is explicitly a murder campaign as retaliation against law enforcement for the shooting death of their gunman comrade. The law enforcement in Atlanta have already stated that they are on high alert because these militants mean it when they call for deadly violence. This week, after the shooting death of the comrade at that so-called autonomous zone south of Atlanta, which, by the way, that militant had shot and tried to kill a Georgia State Patrol trooper who miraculously survived, but is in the ICU and needed surgery. So far, there have been, between last month and the arrest this week, 13 domestic terrorism suspects arrested at the so-called autonomous zone. And this is not a leading story on CNN or NBC or any of these other liberal mainstream networks.
So Andy, are they at it again? I mean, this looks very familiar from 2020 with the autonomous zone in Seattle and Portland, and they were playing this game. I mean, are we going to see another summer of rage coming up in 23? Is this possible? It feels like it's starting. And by the way, point out, as you did point out, that this guy that got killed, he shot a cop first. What the hell do they think was going to happen?
Well, see, for them, they don't need a justification to kill. In their worldview, they believe that they have the right and the mandate actually to kill and maim any political target. And if you fight back, if you shoot back, if you self-defend yourself, you're doing something wrong, which is why from coast to coast, we're seeing all these events that have been organized by militant leftists to go out onto the streets or to host vigil events in honor of what they call now a martyred individual. This is the most disturbing takeaway for me. It's a demonstration that this far-left violent extremist ideology that I've written about, reported on for years, has reached a degree of mainstream level in the United States. There are about a dozen cities that are hosting events in support of the actions of the deceased domestic terrorists. Now, regards to an escalation this summer, well, it's hard to predict. However, what I can say is that the networks and funding streams and organizational strategies that were learned from 2020 are being put into effect as we speak.
Good. Well, let me tell you, this harkens back to 2020. It started in much a similar way. And for them to say that this guy is a martyr, he shot a cop, I mean, it's just scary. It's almost like, some factions of radical Islam who think they're martyred when they blow up a marketplace with a backpack bomb. Andy, no, we'll stay on this because it feels like this isn't the end of this. Andy, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Over the weekend, some violence breaking out in the Atlanta area, a riot. It's interesting. When a riot starts off as a protest, the Democrats involved around this in the media will say it is a peaceful protest that turned into something else. Some protests get the benefit of the doubt. Others, obviously, are the biggest threat to our democracy since Pearl Harbor or whatever. But I want to tell you about this riot that occurred over the weekend. So there's something in the Atlanta area that activists it's the Atlanta Police Department training facility that's being built, which these leftists are calling Cop City. So there was a group, and it was, Clay, over the weekend, I was trying to dive into all this, a group that called themselves the Forest Defenders, who were showing up and engaging in destructive and criminal acts they were sabotaging things, and because they didn't want Cop City, as they call it, to be built, because they thought that this is just the enshrining of the police state or something. It's fascinating, isn't it? The activists say they want just better training for police and de-escalation, and you're going to build this large multidisciplinary law enforcement training facility to do that kind of stuff. De-escalation, non-lethal, whatever. And then the leftists are saying, oh, but it's going to take too many trees and the environmental impact and the enshrining of police because they're lunatics. But the Democrats in the media all have a lot of sympathy for this and for this movement. But this was particularly egregious. There was a lethal shooting here, law enforcement involved shooting of a protester who opened fire on a Georgia State Patrol trooper.
Yes.
So one of these forest defender lunatics pulls a gun and starts shooting at Georgia State police, right? Georgia State police returns fire and kills him. And then other forest defenders, these are all Biden voters, by the way, leftists, decide that they're going to burn down they burned a police vehicle and they're destroying things and engaging in a riot. And somehow we're supposed to think that this is peaceful protest that just got a little out of hand. The whole thing is lunatic stuff.
Yeah, and if you haven't seen the videos, definitely worth watching the videos. Buck, they arrested 6 Antifa, it appears, activists, right? In some way, these groups are connected. All 6 were from outside of Atlanta. I believe 5 were from out of state. One was from Decatur, Georgia, which is a suburb, basically, of Atlanta. The other 5, I believe, were from out of state. All white people. So I just want to point this out. You have out-of-state rioters that are showing up in Atlanta and are burning, looting, pillaging, engaging in violent behavior. And on CNN, which has a substantial footprint in Atlanta, they have a spokesperson go on air and basically say, oh, yeah, I mean, it's a cliche because we've had to go through this so many times. But the amount of time that they say this is, essentially mostly peaceful protest.
We have a journalist on CNN
Yes.
here saying, let's not remember, they marched because they were outraged that a leftist pulled a gun and started firing at cops, and they fired back and killed him. So they're outraged that happened. And then they're marching in Atlanta, and they decide that a group of them, as you said, 6 have been arrested, basically Antifa maniacs. They're domestic terrorists, everybody. That's actually what they are. Let's just use the proper terminology, which you won't hear that on MSNBC or CNN. They start smashing things, destroying property, and lighting a police car on fire. And this is what they're saying over at CNN is this is all happening. Play 7.
I think that there's a real blurring of the lines in the use of the word violence. Is property destruction violence? To some people, it certainly is. But, this idea that breaking windows or other acts of property destruction are the same as actual violence against humans, it's kind of a dangerous and slippery concept. You keep using these words, violent, 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 violent. The only acts of violence against people that I saw were actually police tackling protesters.
Okay. So this is fascinating. This is on CNN's air. I want everyone to hear that. The only violence. Now, he leaves out the violence of the maniac shooting at and trying to murder police officers, which then spurred this whole protest on the streets. But the whole point of the property destruction is, yes, economic pain, but it's also, Clay, meant to intimidate. You could argue by this guy's same logic, hey, I just went into a bank and held a gun up and said, fill my bag full of money. I didn't hurt anybody, right? The impression or the belief that violence is imminent is also something that has to be policed. When you're when you're throwing things and lighting cars on fire, I think people are right to think that's unsafe. You are threatening my physical safety as well as destroying property.
When a police car is burning, that is the essence of violence. So the argument of, oh, it's just property. No. When you burn a police cruiser, that is violent behavior. And to the credit of it's a newly elected mayor of Atlanta. He's been in this office a relatively short period of time. Andre Dickens. He replaced Keisha Lance Bottoms, who I believe is in the Biden administration now. And she was fired up about all the crime-related issues, but just decided not to run. Really, the mayor race in Atlanta turned on who could stamp down on violent crime the most. And I think this is interesting that the mayor of Atlanta pointed out that these violent protesters were from outside of Atlanta and came to the city of Atlanta. Again, Atlanta is a majority black city. We have 6 white Antifa protesters arrested committing acts of violence. The mayor wasn't standing for it. Listen.
They had a protest last night, and it was peaceful. But there were some individuals within that crowd that meant violence. They had explosives. They burned down a police car. They broke windows at businesses. And so our police department, along with our state and federal partners, took swift action within 2 blocks and brought that situation under control. And the violence stopped, and those 6 individuals were arrested. And it should be noted that these individuals were not Atlanta or Georgia residents. Most of them traveled into our city to wreak havoc.
Now, he's saying some of the right things here, and that's why you're pointing that out.
Which is a change, right? From a big city mayor for a change, finally saying we got to stamp this out.
All of the leftists out there, they're running out of excuses and explanations for why whenever people do what the anti-police left wants, everyone is less safe, there's more violence and destruction, and there's urban decay, and the whole thing turns into a mess. They're running out of ways to explain to people, enforcing the law less and deciding that you're going to use social justice instead of criminal justice for police departments. This isn't going to work anymore. And more places are seeing this. Actually, you bring this up. New Orleans, which has the highest per capita murder rate of any major city, which is so, I mean, I know you agree with me. I love New Orleans. I think it's one of the coolest, best towns in the whole country. It's a top 10 city for me in America. I love it. Far too violent right now, obviously. Far too much violence going on in that city. Mayor LaToya Cantrell spoke about it and said some stuff that is on the right track. Listen to this, play 10.
New Orleans has the highest per capita murder rate of any major city. Why?
Why is because, one, dealing with COVID-19, violence, everyone has guns, the lack of the ability to resolve a conflict without reaching and pulling a gun. Also, as it relates to accountability, low-lining offenses, when they don't get bail or they're not restrained, then we're just seeing how these crimes escalate. People need to be held accountable across the board.
Clay, can I just say, so obviously the first thing she said about COVID is preposterous, but that's been a Democrat talking point for a long time now to try to cover up the decay of these Democrat-controlled cities. I think, though, this is part of what you're going to see, this slow shift. Oh, it's still about, COVID or police training or whatever, but she uses this word accountability. What that really means is locking up criminals and enforcing the law. The inescapable truth that even Democrats are now having to face is you have to lock up criminals, you have to enforce the law, or else not only does this stay, it gets worse. And that's where we are.
And they're also slowly having to come to the grips with the fact that this is all George Floyd protest related. The data does not reflect that this occurred because of COVID. It's because Democrats made a conscious decision in the wake of one viral video out of Minneapolis to brand all police as evil and also to essentially tell their base, which is a large portion of many cities, you don't have to respect or comply with police anymore. And in fact, if you get arrested, you're the victim of a structural racist society. And as a result, crime skyrocketed. And now you're seeing that people don't like when crime skyrockets in the cities. I mean, you talk about New Orleans, Buck. For many people who've been down there, it has gotten to the point now where if you stray a little bit outside of the main streets in the French Quarter, you go very far off Bourbon Street at all, it's not safe. And the number one lifeblood for New Orleans and all those businesses is what? Tourism. And if people don't feel comfortable coming on the road and taking a vacation in New Orleans because of the, as you pointed out, rightfully, the highest rate of murder of any decent-sized city in America, then everything starts to fall apart. And everything is falling apart in many of these cities, such that mayors are recognizing.